Hello there and welcome to my Gardener's Friend tutorial. In this short tutorial I'll be talking through my textile collage kit, which has been designed and released with English Heritage as a limited edition. And in this tutorial I'll be having a little chat with you about how to put your textile panel together with the materials that are supplied in the kit. And it's designed to run alongside the printed instructions that come in the box as well. So this is kind of like a complimentary video that just talks you through some of the steps, specifically sort of getting the collage together. And talks a little bit about embroidery, more details of which are in the stitch guide, which is inside of your kit as well. So without further ado, let's get started. In the kit you'll find all of the fabrics that you need to create your robin textile collage, and all of the threads that you need as well. So you just need to simply add your own needle, I've got my case there, some pins, some scissors, have an iron and an ironing board nearby, and a handy addition, as mentioned on the box for the kit, is to have a glue stick nearby. It's a dry sort of glue that doesn't soak through fabric, and when you work with very, very small pieces of textile collage, a glue can be a really useful tool to use instead of a pin, because it can get those small pieces tacked in place until you're ready to sew them. So you'll see all these pieces are stacked up. Just put the threads in the little holly and berry die cut to one side. We've got lots of collage fabrics here. There's a bigger, darker brown piece for the body of the bird. I'll put that to one side. At the bottom you've got some curtain bump, which I sort of buy it as curtain bump. Some people know it as sometimes it's used in quilting for wadding and stuff. It's like it's a much flatter kind of wadding, and I like to use it a lot because it stabilises fabric without being too big and bouncy, but actually when you sew into it, it can sort of give a nice little bit of stability to your fabric and almost like a nice quilted effect once you start stitching, add and stitch. So the first thing to do is put your linen base over that curtain bump. And then you've got a little piece of woven white linen, and you can put this wherever you want. I would avoid putting it right in the middle, because once you build up the robin on there as well, you might find that's a lot of layers of cloth to go through and can be quite tricky to sew. But the idea with this is it breaks up that expanse of white, so you could put it anywhere you wanted, really. You can put it top left, top right, in any of the corners, just off centre perhaps. It's up to you. It's just there to break up that big expanse of white a little bit, just with a little bit of alternative texture. So I'm going to pop that there. And then what we need to do now is start cutting out the robin pattern pieces. So in your instruction booklet, you'll have a page which is you can cut out, which has these pattern pieces on. It won't look exactly like this. I'm working on a slightly different piece of paper because I kind of work with the instructions in the video side by side and sort of develop them so they can complement each other. But this will be a cut out sheet in your booklet. And what you need to do first of all is to cut out all of those pattern pieces ready to pin onto the fabrics. So once those pieces are cut out, we need to pin them onto the corresponding bits of collage fabric and then lay them out onto the white base that we've just done. If you want to familiarise yourself a little bit with the pattern pieces first, you might want to just see how they all line up. So they're all labelled with body, red breast, belly and wing. And you might just want to just familiarise yourself a little bit with those shapes, because the breast and the belly will overlap a little bit. Even I, when I was designing this, cut them out and then had to try and figure out how the bits went back together again, because often they can look quite different once they're made, once they're cut out in fabric. So you can see you've got the red breast goes on first, then the belly. The wing, it's up to you where you want to put it. You can probably see from the box illustration that my wing is coming down a little bit, but you could have it sort of tucked into the tail a little bit more as well. You can really use your creative license with these kits. I always think, you know, you can take the pattern as a base, and then when you add your collage and stitch, you can really make it your own. Similarly with the beak, it's a very small pattern piece which might be difficult to pin and cut round. It might be easier just to draw around it, or you could just draw and cut your own out of some fabric as well if you wanted to. But there is a template there if you need to use the beak template, but it is, as I say, it's the smallest pattern piece. But that's how it would sit together in cloth. So what we need to do now is pin it onto some fabric. So a bit of fluff on that dark brown. So the body and the wing and the beak go onto the dark brown. I used the softest beige with like a little bit of a raised pile for the belly. So that was a nice soft base for a feathery tummy. And the red breast, I used a plain red and then I went over it with polka dot, but you can do what you want. As I say, it's your textile collage. So if you prefer a nice polka dot robin red breast, then you could pin and cut it out from there. So you just need to pin each one on nice and securely, and then you can cut it out, and that should give you the correctly shaped pattern pieces to create your own robin red breast base. on the linen background. Once those are cut out, you can take the pins off. Save your paper templates, you might want to use them again. Oops, I left one in the tail. And you can start to lay out your robin on your base. And again, it's just fitting those puzzle pieces back together. Don't worry if they aren't cut out absolutely perfectly at this point. We've got a little bit of textile collage to put over the top, which can add to the surface, really raises the surface a bit. But also just remember that these are our feathered little friends, and they aren't made of harsh and sharp cut lines. So a slightly more organic line or a slightly more fuzzy edge just makes it look a little bit more, I don't know, gives it a bit more character and a bit more texture. So don't worry too much if it's not an absolutely perfectly straight cut edge. Just gonna wiggle that one down there. I'm going to tuck the eye wing in this time, because on the illustration on the box it's more this sort of shape. I think I'm just going to tuck the wing up into the tail a little bit more for this one, just to show you how you can play around a little bit with those templates. And the beak is there, which is a bit of a snippety snip. It's just that smaller fiddly part, but you can see how very quickly you can get the base of a robin put together on your base fabric. Now the next thing to do is to pin these pieces down, these larger base pieces, and tack them in place. Now you might be wondering about the legs and the branch. When I actually did this, I put those in last, because I kind of got these bits stitched in place first before I started thinking about what went below it, just so that they didn't move when I knew they were in the right place. So once you've got those bits in place, get some pins through your work and just go all the way through the base fabric. I'm going to move that beak because it's so tiny, I'm just going to put that on last. If you want to pin through the base fabric and make sure all those pieces are just pinned in place, and then we can tack all of the pieces in place with some thread. I've just put a pin through the beak as well. If you find that that is just a little bit too fiddly, or it moves around too much and moves out of the place you want it, then I would advise, if you've got a glue stick handy, just pop a little bit of glue on that, and it'll hold it in place just until you tack it in with thread, which is what we're going to do now. So if you unravel your thread card, you've got some hand embroidery threads on one side, and then just some brown and white machine thread on the other side, and it's this side that we use for tacking down. And I always tack my work down with a really simple stab stitch, really in any project that I'm going to do, because I find it really useful to tack everything in place, then get rid of the pins and give things a bit of a press with an iron usually as well, just so I can really see the composition without the pins kind of getting in the way of what I can see. So I'd recommend starting off by tacking the bird in place with those basic pattern pieces, excuse me, just with the dark brown thread. So when you start doing a stab stitch, turn your fabric over and just do a couple of stitches in the same spot through the curtain bump. So I've just cut maybe it's half a metre of brown thread here to start working with. A couple of stitches in the same spot, so if you tug on that needle, it doesn't come out of the fabric. And then push your needle through to the front of the fabric. So this is basically like doing a tacking stitch, but I'm going to keep the small part of the stitch on the front of the fabric, so it can't really be seen, which means it doesn't have to be pulled out of the fabric afterwards. So when I'm doing stab stitch, what I'm going to do is just very close to where I came out of, I'm going to push the needle back through the fabric just to make a tiny sort of pinprick size stitch. And I just sort of work an inch or so apart, working all over the collage and just catching in the pattern pieces with a tiny little stitch. And you can take the pins out as you go. You can see straight away there you start getting wrapped up in the pins. This is one of the reasons why I always do this stitch first before I start embroidery, because I hate when you have to embroider and then you get wrapped up in the pins that are in your work. So this is a great way just to get rid of the pins as you go. So you can see the general pattern of stitching if I turn this over, and you can see that the bigger tacking stitches do get dragged across the back. So a couple of stitches in the same spot to anchor your thread off, and then switch it over. And you can see that you can't really see the tacking stitches on the front, but I've got rid of all the pins now, and that's firmly in place, that's stitched in place. I'm going to do the same thing now with some of the white machine thread on here, and I'm just going to do the same thing, anchor some white thread into the back of the fabric and just work it from left to right across the white, just at sort of 1.5 inch intervals maybe, just to get this white linen tacked down onto the curtain bump. So you can see there the white's all stitched down. You can see some little pucker marks in it, which is where you get a bit of a slight quilted effect from the curtain bump. You can see if you work really rigidly in rows, you can see that in quite a line, or you can dot it about and be a little bit more random with it, so it's a bit less obvious. Whatever works for you, as long as it just gets that bump attached to the linen base, that's great. And then the next thing we need to do is build upon this base, so we go from something that looks like this to something that starts to look more like this. You can add as much or as little textile collage as you like. You can keep it quite simple if you want to and really build a surface up with stitch. You can see with this one here, if I just bring that up a little bit in the light, I've started to work on top of that base with some extra snippets of fabric. So that's what we're going to do now, build this little bit of surface up and then think about what we put in the bottom here as well. So I've just roughly cut out a twig so that the robin looks like it's sitting on a branch. So I'm going to use the dark brown for that again. And I'm just going to cut sort of a very rough wedge of the dark brown. I almost think the rougher the better, so it looks more twig-like, not too perfect. So just little snips, shearing away at the cotton. So I'm going to put the thicker, heavier end at the bottom of the composition so it doesn't get too top heavy. Add another little bit on maybe. Create a little bit of twiggy interest. That's a little bit blunt there, so let's just snip that away. This is where you can start having fun really, because you can start snipping and arranging and playing. It's the faffing about stage, that's what I call it, and I quite like it. You can also place your holly and berries on there as well. I put mine on the branch, but you could have yours on the corner. You might even want to pop it in, you know, sort of, I don't know, maybe you could put it in the bird's beak. But I just put mine in the corner here as a little nod to the festive season. If you wanted to put some lighter strips of fabric on that branch as well, you could. This silk is quite nice because it really frays quite nicely, so you can sort of have strands of it that you can stitch down as well. Really play about with fraying the fabric out and experiment with the torn edge. Just going to pop a little bit here as well. It's just enjoying playing around with the collage, little bits of fabric, just to get those little bases in place. But don't use textile collage for the legs because they need to be sort of quite slender for robin's legs, so we just put those in with stitch later on. So don't worry about the space that you've got in between the bird and the branch. And the next thing we need to do as well is start thinking about some collage on the bird to really build the surface up. And I do that just by cutting small pieces of cloth out. I'd use slightly larger pieces for the wing first of all, so I added some little slivers of fabric. I don't cut out a specific pattern shape, I just use the sort of the back of the blade. I make a small snip of notion and just pull the fabric through the blades so that you get quite a rough edge when you cut it, which is quite nice because you've got lots of feathered textures that you're trying to interpret in cloth. So little rough edges and soft edges work quite nicely. So it's just sort of laying those little pieces onto the wing, perhaps in places. You might want to put a little bit down the tail. There's no kind of right or wrong with this. It really is just about picking out some extra bits of fabric and adding them onto that bird. So I'm going to do a little bit of a cap on the wing. Sometimes I put pieces down, decide they don't fit, and then have to trim them again. It's just enjoying the arranging of the fabrics. It's quite nice. Let's pop a little bit on the edge of the wing there as well. And then you can also build up the breast and the belly. And I like to do that with small bits of the silk and the gauze and the polka dot as well, just to build up little bits of texture. And for this, I just cut really small pieces, and this is where the glue stick comes in handy. You might find it useful actually just to create a little collection of small snippets before you start, and then it's almost like you can just choose from those what you put onto your bird. So I've just got some little snippets of the various collage fabrics. I've cut out a couple of little pieces of the lighter brown colour as well, because sometimes it is quite nice just to put a bit of a darker shade under the throat. But it is just about mixing and matching and seeing how it all comes together. So this gauze is really lovely. I keep saying gauze, it's more like a mesh, like an underskirt sort of mesh. And it might even just tear as easily as it'll cut. Sometimes it does. Yeah, so it will tear as well, and then you get this lovely kind of rippled edge when you tear it. And that's lovely for creating texture over many different colours because it's see-through. So I've just kind of made little, almost like little leaf shapes, I guess, in the polka dot and the beige. And what I'm sort of aiming to do is work down from the beak to sort of create the idea of feathers textures. I'm going to put some browns in there and just hide them underneath so they're not too prominent. But it's really nice as well, it's quite big, it's really nice as well to overlap between the two parts of the belly, so where those two pattern pieces meet, it's nice to overlap the collage pieces so that you almost blend that really bold line between the two colours, just to give it a bit of a softer appearance. Put a little bit of brown in there as well. And this is where the glue stick comes in handy, because when you're sort of happy with it, you can lift these and just pop a little bit of glue on them instead of having to pin every single piece in place. Now, when I used to teach in classrooms, I used to think glue on fabric was an awful idea. And I would still say it is in some cases. Things like PVA glue on fabric it's never really a good combination because it soaks through and it makes fabric really stiff and difficult to sew. But the great thing with a glue stick, I think, in particular, is that because it's quite dry in its nature, you can tack it onto fabric. It won't soak through the fabric and mark the cloth. And it just holds long enough for you to get some stitches in there to get it permanently held in place. So I think in some cases like this, it has its uses. So when you fiddled about a bit and had to think about where the fabrics might go, just drag a piece of fabric across the top of a glue stick, and you can pop it into place when you're ready to go back to it with stitch. Pop these little bits in as well. Oh, there's my dog barking. He's outside on a lovely summer's day while I'm recording this. So I'm just going to pop a little bit of glue on these brown bits as well. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the beige, with some of the lighter coloured silks. Just to build up that texture even more. And I'm going to alternate that with this lovely fine mesh. And it's nice to have some of the base fabrics showing through still, so you can still see some of the red and you can still see some of this lovely fuzzy texture on the belly, but you can just build it up with other textures as well. And you can overlap from the edge. Don't be afraid to go over the edges. That's what gives it its texture, especially when you start adding stitch as well. Just tuck that under the wing there. So it's all about building up that texture. And you can see with just a few little pieces there, how I've already started to pick the texture up. Don't worry if it looks a bit messy at this stage. You know, this, even the one that I've got as a finished sample, looked like this at some point. It will always look a little bit like this until you start getting stitch into it later on. But have a little play around with collage. If you've got a glue stick, use that just to tack those pieces in place. And then the next thing is you can either go straight into embroidery, or as I prefer to do, you can just do a little bit more stab stitch and just stab stitch with the white or the dark brown machine threads, just as we did before. Stab stitch these extra pieces in place, especially the branch, before you start hand embroidery, because it's just nice to have all those pieces secured in place so that when you start some hand embroidery with these bigger threads, everything's in place, it's not going to move, and you can just concentrate on adding texture with some really simple running stitches. So once you've got your collage stab stitched in place, I always like to give everything a good press. Just a nice idea really. Once you've been handling the fabric, it can get a bit crumpled. So do cover it with a clean cloth, just in case anything sticks to your iron plate or anything from your iron plate transfers onto your collage. I think it's always just good practice to cover it with a tea towel or just a clean piece of cotton or linen. This is quite a textured tea towel, so I think I've just put like a texture into my fabric, but that'll iron out later on when I'm all finished. But it just gives it a bit of a press so you can really see your collage. There's no pins in it, and it's ready for some hand embroidery. I've designed this kit quite specifically to use some very, very simple stitches, because I'm a firm believer that really basic stitches can actually give you really lovely results if you just use them the way you'd perhaps use a pencil line and sketch them and scatter them across your piece. So if I can just show you this sample that I've got here. I'm just going to pop it into the light so you can see the texture of the stitches. I know it's sometimes difficult to see really clearly the texture up close, but there's a lot of running stitch in there. So it's just very simple stitches, just taking the thread in and out of the fabric to create dashed lines. I don't know if you can see, just if I bring that very slowly, there's a little bit of very dark brown seed stitch there on the dark brown fabric. So even if you've got stitches that you can't see so well, they can add texture to your cloth. I've used white just along the edges for this little panel to get just over stitched it with running stitch, just to give a bit of texture. There's a lot of running stitch on the breast, and it just goes in the shape of the bird's belly. So all the running stitches are in that sort of nice semicircular pattern, which just helps the eye with the, sort of give the impression of feathers that grow down and grow around and under. And the more you sew, you find with some of these fabrics, they'll start to fray a little bit, especially that shot silk, which is really nice because it softens up these edges and it gives that lovely kind of fuzzy, soft underbelly texture, which we want for a bird. And similarly on the branch, there's just some running stitches going along, just along the branch, just to tack it in place. And there's a little bit of running stitch on the holly there as well. So you have a stitch guide in the kit. Again, my version will look a bit different to yours because, as I said before, I sort of do the instructions and the video alongside each other so they can complement each other. So you'll have a bit more detail on your stitch guide. But I've tried to do this particular kit with a stitch guide in colour. So you can see where I've used a red thread, where I've used a beige thread, where I've used light brown and where I've used dark brown as well. And the little dots indicate French knots, which I'm going to demonstrate now because I realise that running stitch, while that is a very, very simple stitch and you can use it as a running stitch or a seed stitch, which you'll see in the instruction booklet under the stitch guidelines, French knots can be hard to do from just a diagram. So I thought I'd just end this video after the stitch talk through by just showing you how to do a French knot. I'm a big fan of using 6-stranded cotton. It gets its name if you haven't used it before because it's made up of 6 strands. And the temptation when you split these strands, because you don't really use all 6 together often, especially for a piece of this sort of scale, because it can look quite chunky in a small piece. The temptation when you split these is often to split them and pull them apart. But what can happen then is that the thread twists and you inevitably end up with a bit of a knot. So if you split all of those little threads between your finger and thumb, and then just grab one and pull straight up and out, you'll find that you can split them and lay them back down without causing a knot. So I'm going to use 2 strands to do a demonstration of French knots. For much of this project, I just used 1 strand for the bird because it is such a small piece that I wanted the stitches to look fine, and I didn't really want sort of 3 or 4 strands looking quite clunky on that small scale textile collage. Okay, so I'm just going to demonstrate a French knot quickly, and I'm going to do it where the eye is going to go. Because the eye on this is just 1 little French knot in very dark brown, and then I've just taken a single strand of white and just in the tiniest little stitch through it to create that white fleck in the eye, because I think just a plain dark brown eye might, I don't know, maybe it's like look a little bit sort of lifeless, so just that little white gleam in its eye sort of brings the face to life a little bit. So I've got 2 strands of the darkest brown thread, and I'm just going to bring it up just in line with the topmost part of the beak. So I'm sort of drawing an imaginary line over there. Oh, I haven't secured that bit down. I'm just going to take that out of the way so it's not flapping about while I'm trying to do this demonstration. And I've zoomed in a little bit just to try and show you better. So I've got a little knot at the end of my thread. I'm just going to bring that up through the fabric. Now I'm left-handed, so I might do this in reverse to some people. What you need to do is grab the thread about an inch away from where it came out through the fabric, and then with your other hand, wrap that thread around your needle just 2 or 3 times, and keeping a hold of both pieces of thread, just gently, not too tight, just slide your needle back and push it slowly back in to where it came from. So you've got that little twist going around the needle, but you're not letting go here just yet. If we let go of that, the knot becomes really loose, which is lovely if you're doing things like big snowflakes later on, but for an eye it needs to be sort of a little bit more, a little tighter. I'm just going to push that needle through the cloth, pull my thread through. I can let go of it now because it's on its way through, and you just get that little French knot for an eye. Now that's quite a tightly coiled one. If you keep the thread really loose around the needle, then you can do things like create snowflakes. And French knots look great in clusters, look really good in clusters to create a bit of texture. So you can see there, as well as all of that running stitch with the textile collage to create texture, you can build the surface up and make these much loopier and messier to create things like snow. So just to have a quick talk through the embroidery, I know I mentioned that there's a lot of running stitch, and some of the running stitch, while it's used to create lines on the body, some of it's used to soften up the silhouette as well. So if you can see in the light there, there's a little running stitch that just goes over the edge of the dark brown template. There's some French knots in the background. We've got the French knot for the eye. There's a little bit of beige under the eye, again just to try and bring that face to life a little bit and give it a bit of character. Most of the wing is just straight running stitch, but you can see I've gone all the way around the edges with the brown, and that just breaks up that harsh edge, makes it look a little bit more fuzzy like a bird might look. And there's lots of running stitch down here, as I mentioned before, going in that semicircular shape, and it's really important to overlap where the red hits the beige, because then you do get this nice sort of blending of stitch and fabrics as well, and that just really helps to soften the breast area up. You might find that you don't need a lot of stitching on the beak because it is quite a small pattern piece. I've just put a couple of the lightest brown in there, but you don't need too much. You don't want to sort of stitch over it too much and break up the nice fine point of the beak. And that's pretty much it for the running stitch and the French knots. Again, you can just a few along the branches, enough just to tack it in place and give it a bit of texture. So the last thing I'm going to mention are the legs, and I'll just do that on my working sample that I've got in front of me here. So with the legs, I've just used 2 strands of the darkest brown thread again, and you don't want to overcomplicate them. You need them coming from just sort of the back of the belly, the underbelly, and just do one long stitch at an angle onto the branch. Now it's amazing how just a couple of very straightforward stitches can just suddenly bring it to life a little bit and give it a little bit of grounding once you get that bird perched on the branch. Oops. Didn't catch that one in properly. This is why it's good to have everything stab stitched in place first. So just not too parallel, and you can have 2 little legs there perched on a branch. And then I just do a couple of little running stitches for the feet, just so it looks like they're clutching the branch a little bit. And they're sort of marked out in black on the stitch diagram, so you can see that a little bit more clearly, how you could put a couple of running stitches together to create this sort of claw-like effect, so it looks like it's holding on onto the branch. And then it looks like our bird isn't sort of floating in midair. But just a couple of little stitches can help it look like it's secured onto the branch. So I hope you found that a helpful sort of talk through with just how to get the collage together. And I hope you found it useful to sort of see it in its different stages as well, because it does look very different when it's just a basic collage compared to when it's got a little bit more built up on it and it's been stitched into as well. The hand embroidery really changes the texture. And I think the nice thing with these kits as well is, although you have the same instructions with every kit, no two will look the same, because you can really sort of have free reign with how much or how little hand embroidery you put on top. And you can see how it really it adds a lot of texture to the piece as well once you've got lots of running stitching. So sometimes the simplest of stitches can give a really nice effect. You might want to pop your finished piece in a frame, or if you wanted to have it as a free hanging piece, you could perhaps overstitch the edges or sew some nice coloured felt onto the back, maybe sew it onto a nice rustic twig, and it could be maybe a festive decoration that comes out once a year, a little keepsake. But I hope you enjoy working through your kit, and I hope you found the video useful. There are contact details in the kit as well, so if you've got any questions or you want to run anything past me or even share what you've made, I do love it when I see the end result of a kit. But thank you very much for watching, and happy sewing.